Hi, and welcome to this video on managing conflict and the topics of conflict at work initially, and then also collective action. You'll have already seen a number of mentions or topics that relate to conflict in core management concepts so far. If we look at the world through a conflict lens, and in particularly the business world, you can see conflict almost everywhere. So just a few examples of topics that you've covered so far. The principal agent problem has conflict between the principal and the agent and what they see as being optimizing behavior at its very heart. So they each want to optimize their own resources, and achieving so often doesn't optimize the resources of the other. The engineering view of management, so for example, Taylorism and scientific management, tries to solve the conflicts between workers and their managers. The Hawthorne studies identified conflict between members of teams and saw people reduce productivity to avoid conflict. So do you remember we got people who were trying not to be rate busters or chiselers? And Mintzberg's model of management contains multiple roles that look at avoiding and dealing with conflict, including disturbance handler. So we see conflict already in heaps of places, and we're only partway through the course. So plenty more to come. And what it reminds us of is how important it is to understand what conflict is, how it occurs, how it can be managed, and how it impacts the workplace. So initially, let's just think about types of interpersonal conflict, because according to some, conflict shouldn't always be seen as bad. There is an optimal level of conflict where it creates production, cooperation, and so forth. Too little can lead to apathy, groupthink, stagnation. Too much can lead to disruption, arguments, lack of cooperation, and hostility. So managers have a key role to play in helping companies to achieve optimum levels of conflict, where there's not too little conflict and not too much. And when they're looking to reduce dysfunctional conflict, they can take a number of different conflict resolution approaches. So this is covered in more details in the notes. You can read more there about the 5 different actions that managers can take. But what you can see here is that a number of different approaches, such as avoiding, isn't very helpful. If you're unassertive and uncooperative and you just avoid the conflict, in most situations, that's not going to be useful. What you're looking for much more is a way to collaborate, or a way to engage in more assertive and more cooperative behaviours that ultimately help to deal with the conflict. So make sure you have a look at that in the notes, but recognise that managers have a key role to play in reducing dysfunctional conflict. We'll now move on to have a quick look at collective action and conflict, and how this is an important part of the contemporary workplace. So in early industrial society, so in the sorts of settings that we saw when we were looking at factories in the first couple of units, workers felt very controlled, and it led them to create organised acts of resistance, with workers forming unions. So if those workers lived in towns that were dominated by 1 or 2 companies, for example, they would have very little choice over where to work, it was one factory or the other, how to work, in other words, what job to do, or what they were going to be paid for it. And workers didn't like this. It didn't feel comfortable. It wasn't a welcome process for many workers. So they resisted, and their resistance took the form of unionisation and political action. So that's where unions came from. The reason why unions were successful is because companies could not afford for their workforce to down their tools. So you couldn't afford for everyone to go on strike. And that's what unions are able to threaten, is that rather than people acting individually when they're upset, people act as a group. So if everyone feels as though the wages in the factory aren't good enough, or health and safety isn't good enough, then they all say, we will stop working together, and you will not be able to produce your goods or services, and you will not be able to succeed in the market. So companies needed to find a way to cooperate with the workers rather than encouraging conflict and coercion. They had to find a way to control labour, but also in doing so, they had to buy labour. They had to pay them a decent salary for a day's work. Otherwise, the companies couldn't produce what they needed to. And as you can see, trade unions grew substantially until the 1920s, and then dropped in membership, and then membership climbed up again until the 1980s and dropped again. And what we can see here, though, is that there is a downward trend that has been taking place since the late 1970s, early 1980s, where union membership has declined significantly. Union membership does still exist though, because it is able to provide members with a number of things, but these things also explain the downfall of unions, as you'll see in a moment, because these things aren't valued in the same way anymore. The things that a union can give are firstly collective representation, so they can act as a voice for the workforce as a whole in benefit and wage bargaining, so in helping workers to get a fair rate for their work. And they can also add they used to add a significant wage differential as a result until around 1950. So if you were a member of the union, you would be better paid than being a non-union member, because the union would have fought for a higher salary for you. Unions also provide individual representation. So if there are grievances or disciplinary procedures, they can provide protection and support in those situations. You've seen when we talked about the psychological contract before that an employment contract doesn't cover all expectations that a worker has of an employer or vice versa. There are gaps in the employment contract which might need filling in through discussion or negotiation, and a union can help with this. And thirdly, a union can provide personal insurance. So you pay to belong to the union, and then they will help you out if you are unemployed or if you have ill health. The payment that you made to the union provides a form of insurance that if something bad happened to you, the union might give you money to help you till you can go back to work and resume whatever it is you were doing. Early unions had a particularly important role to play here because there was no such thing as the welfare state. When we talk about the welfare state, we mean the government or the country providing money to help people in the case of ill health, which is more and more common, this idea of a welfare state, and therefore they had as much benefit to people as they had the funds to provide sickness benefit. They could help with unemployment, they could help as well, unfortunately, with funeral benefits. So 3 forms of benefits that the union provides people with: collective representation, individual representation, and personal insurance. The question is, are these things still valued from a union as much today as they were back in the day? We'll come back to that question in a moment. Just before we do, why is it that companies or organisations deal with unions? So why do they not just say, we're not prepared to recognise you and we're not talking to you? The reasons are threefold. Firstly, the economic benefits of engaging with unions often outweigh the costs, because it's cheaper potentially to agree a small wage differential than risk the whole workforce striking and losing out on a day or more's worth of production. Secondly, you can remedy defects highlighted by workers before they leave. So in other words, reducing the likelihood that they will leave, and also improving company processes in the process. And then thirdly, paying higher wages should, according to economic theory, get you better workers and lower the need for management. Better workers will stay for the better wages. And the better the people are, the less management costs you have, because there's less need to monitor, control, and take action if there are problems. However, over the years, as we saw on the previous graph, unions have declined for 4 major reasons. So firstly, other voice mechanisms emerged. Companies found that it was often beneficial just to speak directly to staff rather than going through a union, trying to resolve things directly. The HRM function that we've already looked at in previous units took over union tasks. So they started to deal with sick pay, pension plans, and so forth as benefits of working for the company. And employment legislation grew as well, with the government, with the legal system of a country protecting workers from, for example, health and safety and bad employment contract issues. There was no longer a need for union protection. Thirdly, the wage benefit of belonging to a union started to erode, with the wage increase spilling over to non-union workers, who also got a wage uplift every time the unions negotiated with the managers to improve wages. And therefore, finally, unions are less prevalent today, but they certainly do still exist. Because whilst conflict with individuals can be problematic, conflict with large numbers of workers through collective action still continues to create much bigger problems and can be a vehicle that workers choose to use in order to solve big problems. So we see unionisation as very much this thing that happens when employees band together, but we can see collective action increasingly taking place in non-business contexts as well. In other words, people outside the employment relationship engaging in collective action to encourage companies, governments, and specific societal groups to be better, nicer, fairer, or something else. So, for example, the fairly recent uprising against the police force in the USA due to racism. So even where this is aimed at government, it's still relevant to managers because governments are still full of managers, and the actions of the government can enact legal change, which then impacts businesses and their managers. So, for example, anti-racism legislation. We can also see collective action taking place, not just in firms with their workers and their staff, but also through people such as customers who use online collective action as a way to provide a collective voice. And this type of collective action prompted by online interaction has been termed connective action. And there's lots of examples of connective action from the past few years, being seen as not just key social media movements, but spilling over into having large impacts on pushes for legislation, the ways that companies are expected to run, and so forth. So pick just three here. Yes All Women, where users share examples of misogyny and violence, which has shaken up a number of industries. Black Lives Matter, which is of course the global network to bring justice, healing and freedom to Black people across the globe. And again, big impacts on workplaces who aren't taking diversity seriously. And then finally, Extinction Rebellion, where participants stage actions to demand a response to the climate and ecological emergency, again having direct and indirect impacts on businesses. Thanks for listening to this session. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you will tune in to watch some of the future sessions for core management concepts. Thanks a lot. Bye.